The beloved church was irrevocably destined for destruction, and all of its money, labors, and membership were to be taken into Babylon and be controlled by Babylon. You can find this in Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 4 and 5. Thus the whole church, as well as all those who were in any way connected with her, would become a part of Babylon and would be numbered with them. And no one, not even God himself, would prevent this from occurring. You can find this in Jeremiah 21, verses 4 to 6. Thus the voice of mirth and gladness would be heard no more at all in the church. Neither would the sound of a millstone be heard any more in her. And the light of a candle would shine no more at all in her. And the voice of the bridegroom and of his bride, being both outside of the church, would be heard no more at all in her. You can find this in Jeremiah 25:10 and 16 verse 9. But God, in his great and infinite love and mercy for his people, provided them with a way of escape from being destroyed. God began preparing his people to physically separate out of the midst of Jerusalem. You can find this in Jeremiah 6 verse 1. He did this so that his people could come away from their corrupted nation, which was holding them captive under the influence of men, and go through the wilderness experience once again so that they could see and feel their need of God. You can find this in Jeremiah 3, verses 14 to 19. God had determined that separation was a necessity, and all of God's people would have to go forth from their church. You can find this in Jeremiah 15, verse 1. The members must willingly separate themselves from their church or be destroyed along with their beloved church. We're told in Jeremiah 21, verse 8 and 9, And unto this people thou shalt say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He that abideth in this city shall die by the sword and by the famine and by the pestilence. But he that goeth out, his life shall be unto him for a prey. So the way of life, or separation from the church, and the way of death, or remaining connected and within the church, was clearly laid out before all, and all were tested as to whom they would obey, either God or man. Obedience to either message decided whether you would become wheat or worthless chaff. You can find this in Jeremiah 23, verse 28. Thus eternal life depended upon which message you followed and obeyed. In fact, even Jeremiah chose to separate himself out of the church in the eyes of all the people. In Jeremiah 37, verse 12, we read, Then Jeremiah went forth out of Jerusalem to separate himself thence in the midst of the people. Yet was heard the lying voices of the false prophets, or the church ministers, or leaders, and the ministers or the priests of the church, saying, Peace, peace, we are still God's chosen people and his only church. Do not be afraid, we shall never have to leave this place. You can find this in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4, and 5, verse 14. But God had told them clearly, If ye thoroughly amend your ways and your doings and continue to do good, then I will cause you to dwell in this place and not to leave it. That was Jeremiah 7, verses 5 to 7. But the people had forgotten that it was only upon condition of obedience to God and his words, and in acknowledging and repenting of their sins, that God's promises would be fulfilled to them, and that they could remain his people in church without being removed. Yet the people would not know this. You can find this in Jeremiah 3, verse 12 to 13, chapter 4, verse 1, and chapter 8, verse 7. They would not know this. The priests and church supporters were falsely prophesying and stating that because God had seen fit to deposit his holy oracles or his law with only their religious nation, as we're told in Jeremiah 8:8, then the prophetic destiny for their church was that it would go through safely unto the end. You can find this in Jeremiah 23, verse 16 to 17. They said, There is peace and victory prophesied for the church, not evil, So all of this talk of the necessity for separation out of the church is certainly not so. You can find this in Jeremiah 8, verse 10 to 12. False watchmen and church supporters were lying in God's name, proclaiming that God's favor was still with them and that there was no need to separate out of the church because their beloved church was prophetically destined to never become a part of, nor ever to be established in, Babylon, and would not become desolate or destroyed. You can find this in Jeremiah 27, verses 14 to 17. They were making the membership to trust in a blatant lie. You can find this in Jeremiah 28:15. And were teaching them rebellion against God's will and His commands. In Jeremiah 28:16. But God had said that they were not going through to heaven, but were to be cast down. You could find this in Jeremiah 7:14 and 8:12. Now some thought that by living a righteous example within Jerusalem, that many would be led to follow their righteous example. But this did not occur because of the great wickedness that was in the midst of the church. Jeremiah 6:29. Needless to say, the majority flatly refused to obey God and turned away from following the word of the Lord through His messenger. They would rather fight against God and His will than to willingly separate themselves from their beloved but corrupt church. But there were a faithful few who heard and found these words of God, and they ate them up, rejoicing to be able to follow the expressed will of God instead of following the expressed will of man or even their own will. You can find this in Jeremiah 15:16. These remnant willingly and gladly obeyed the Lord and separated themselves from the midst of their wicked church and returned to God, and it was well with them. You can find this in Jeremiah 15:11 and verse 17. God brought them back as His chosen people, and they were able to stand before Him. This is Jeremiah 15:19. God's command to the separated people were, "If thou take forth the precious from the vile, thou shalt be as my mouth. Let them," or the church membership, "return unto thee, but return not thou unto them." That was Jeremiah 15:19. So after the people separated to God, they were not to go back to the church, but to allow the membership to come to them for the words of life. But even though the church leaders and church supporters would do all in their power to come against these messengers and the separation message they preached, yet they could not be able to prevail or to stop the message from going forth in power, because God was with these remnant to defend and save them. You can find this in Jeremiah 15:20 to 21. Those who obey God had to separate themselves willingly from their wicked and God-forsaken church, because God had, quote, "sent them out of this place for their good." That was Jeremiah 24, verse 5. And God would not forsake those who had willingly separated, because He had promised to build them up and plant them, making His new covenant with them to be their God and they His people, writing His law within their hearts. And it was only those who had obeyed and separated and lived this new covenant experience who would be God's children and His chosen people once again. You can find this in Jeremiah 24, verses 6 and 7. And these would bear good fruit. You can find this in Jeremiah 24, verse 5. Whereas those who chose to obey the false message of their lying watchmen and church supporters, those who refused to separate from their beloved church, disobeyed God and would bear fruit like evil and rotten figs, which would be of no use to anyone, to be destroyed. You can find this in Jeremiah 24, verses 8 through 10. You see, both God and the church leadership were trying to save the church. God was trying by mercy and truth to save His church of faithful people from being destroyed along with the wicked by calling them to separate for their good. While the church leadership were trying by lies and force to save their church from being destroyed by keeping the people within supposedly for their good. Thus, a life and death controversy between God's message of truth and Satan's message of falsehood was full-blown. Separation out of the church was a chance for life, but remaining connected with her was certain death. You could find this in Jeremiah 21, verses 8 and 9. But all the people had the chance to hear and obey, and all made their decision to leave or stay. Babylon captured the church, broke down her walls and pillars one by one, and removed everything that was sacred and holy. You can find this in Jeremiah 52, verses 13 and 14, and 17 to 23. And when Babylon was finished, the church, to all who would see, had a completely different look than it did in the beginning. Thus God's once pure and chosen church and people were completely desolate and a part of Babylon. You can find this in Jeremiah 25, verses 9 through 11. The way of life, or separation, and the way of death, or remaining connected and a member in, was clearly shown to all who would see and hear. And all made their decision on which side of the wall of separation they were going to stand on and whom they were going to fight for, either God or Satan. The wall of separation was again built up. The breaches were repaired. One group chose to stand for God and to follow His word, while the other chose to disobey God and to stand upon the word of man. Now, for more information regarding this particular age, please write for our booklet entitled Jeremiah, The Message Then is the Message Now, at the address of this ministry. God's people in church were taken captive by and completely controlled by Babylon, and for many years the people had continued to worship in their Babylonian churches, believing that there was no other choice. But it was God's purpose that 3 generations after every religious nation in the whole world had become captured by and controlled by and connected to and a part of Babylon, that He would call out of Babylon any who wanted to serve Him and be His people once again. You can find this in Jeremiah 27:7, 27:22, 29:10-14, and 30, verse 3. After 3 generations, there would be many new innocent believers that were raised up in Babylon, and God would not leave these honest ones to remain corrupted by ignorantly continuing to remain a part of Babylon. So these also must be tested. In mercy, God again called for all of His true people to come out from their corrupted Babylonian churches and enter into a wilderness experience where God alone would be their leader and where His grace was only to be found. You can find this in Jeremiah 31, verse 1 and 2. God would, because of His infinite love and mercy, call and draw any who would not resist Him to separate. In Jeremiah 31, verse 3, we're told, "The Lord hath appeared of old unto me, saying, Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore with loving kindness have I drawn thee." God's purpose was that He would again build up only those who separated to be His Mount Zion and remnant people. We're told this in Jeremiah 31, verse 4-6, and also Jeremiah 31, verse 7. God would become a father to only those who separated unto Him. These would be accepted back as God's chosen people once again. We're told this in Jeremiah 31, 8-9, 32, verse 37-41, and 33, verse 6-11. God was again calling for the line of demarcation to be made plain and distinct between His followers and Satan's followers. God raised up Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Haggai, as well as others to be His messengers and to preach this precious and loving message of separation. This separation was to be a willing choice, not a forced obedience. In Ezra chapter 7 verse 13 we're told, "All they of the people of Israel which are minded of their own free will to go up to Jerusalem or to separate from Babylon." God's people were not told to wait for the Babylonian churches to kick them out or force them to leave. They were to make a willing choice to leave and obey God themselves, or to disobey God and stay. And what was the purpose for the necessity of this separation? It was so the people could connect themselves and unite themselves only to God, and then work to build up His kingdom of Jerusalem once again. And it was only those that fully separated themselves who had this glorious privilege to become a part of and to become established in God's kingdom. Those who separated were the only people whom God could trust to show forth His grace and glory to all the earth. This merciful message of willing separation from all the churches in Babylon went far and wide, and many were aroused by this loving call. This message was not just given once, but it was given many times from different messengers of the Lord. But many had become quite comfortable in Babylon and had grown at ease while being connected to her. Many did not want their peace broken and refused to separate from their Babylonish churches when the call came to them. In fact, it was found out that of all the people who heard the call to separate and become God's special people once again, only a very small remnant had willingly obeyed. You can find this in Ezra chapter 8 verses 1 to 14. The majority had chosen to disobey God's will and had failed their test. It was also discovered that none of the sons of Levi, or those ministers especially dedicated to follow all the will and commands of God, had at first separated themselves. You can find this in Ezra chapter 8 verse 15. Although a few ministers did willingly separate themselves, but it was at the last opportunity to do so. You can find this in Ezra chapter 8 verse 16 to 20. But because they waited until the last opportunity to separate, their lack of a prompt obedience to God had caused others to follow their example of disobedience. They had failed at a time when the influence of a prompt decision to accompany those who had separated would have led others to follow the example of these ministers and to also separate. But their strange indifference to God's will is a sad revelation of the real attitude towards God's purpose for His people. We're told in Prophets and Kings, pages 614 to 616, there was pressing need of men of God to act as teachers of the people. And besides, the Jews remaining in Babylon were in danger of having their religious liberty restricted. The time had come when it was perilous for them to dwell longer in the midst of heathen influences. In view of these changed conditions, the priests in Babylon should have been quick to discern in the issuance of the decree a special call to them to return to Jerusalem. The sons of Levi failed at a time when the influence of a decision to accompany their brethren would have led others to follow their example. Their strange indifference is a sad revelation of the attitude of the Israelites in Babylon towards God's purpose for His people. Once more, Ezra appealed to the Levites, sending them an urgent invitation to unite with this company. To emphasize the importance of quick action, he sent with his written plea several of his chief men and men of understanding. Ezra 7:28 and 8:16. While the travelers tarried with Ezra, these trusted messengers hastened back with the plea, "Bring unto us ministers for the house of our God." Ezra 8:17. The appeal was heeded. Some who had been halting made final decision to return. In all, about 40 priests and 220 Nethinim, men upon whom Ezra could rely as wise ministers and good teachers and helpers, were brought to the camp. Faith in the power of the living God would be strengthened if the Israelites themselves should now reveal implicit faith in their divine leader. They therefore determined to put their trust wholly in him. They would ask for no guard of soldiers. They would give the heathen no occasion to ascribe to the strength of man the glory that belongs to God alone. They could not afford to arouse in the minds of their heathen friends one doubt as to the sincerity of their dependence upon God as his people. Strength would be gained not through wealth, not through the power and influence of idolatrous men, but through the favor of God. Only by keeping the law of the Lord before them and striving to obey it would they be protected. Now, how many chose to willingly obey God and willingly separated out of Babylon? We're told in Ezra chapter 2, verses 64 and 65, and Ezra 8, verses 1 through 14, it was about 50,000. But in comparison with all the vast multitude that was found in Babylon who had chosen to remain, it was just a very small remnant. You can find this in Prophets and Kings on page 598. This call for a willing and complete separation was given many times, not just once, but many times. But those which heard the first call to separate and who chose not to respond to it, heard the second call also, and then the third, and so on. And as each time they heard the call, but refused or ignored it, they became less and less impressionable on the other calls that came to them. These became more and more determined against ever obeying God's will as they continued to hear more and more calls for them to separate, until they flatly refused to obey. You can find this in Prophets and Kings on page 598 to 600. But the distinction was made plain between God's people, those who chose to follow him, versus Satan's followers, those who chose to abide in his camp. The difference between those who chose to serve God versus those who chose to serve the devil became more and more distinct, more and more plain. The wall of separation was again being made up. The breaches were being repaired, and it was being established. And brothers and sisters, it was only those who chose to willingly separate themselves from Babylon who had their names registered and written in the book. You can find this in Ezra chapter 2, verse 62. And very sadly, it was found that the majority of all those who professed to serve God had instead chosen to disobey him and his will. These failed their great test. These chose not to separate, but to remain connected with, and their names were not recorded in the book, and they were lost for eternity. This then brings us to part 3 in this Bible History of Separation series, or the history from John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, and the disciples to the present day.